So I'm really pleased that John Kotek is here with us today to give this talk. John is currently the Vice President for Policy Development and Public Affairs at the Nuclear Energy Institute. This is a position that he's just taken recently. He's been there 3 months, 4 months, something like that. Before that, as many of you know, he was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Nuclear Energy at Department of Energy. And this is the highest level in the department for nuclear energy issues, and we were happy John was there. He worked with us on one of the projects we had during that time, and that office, as many of us know, is the principal office where a lot of the funding for a lot of the nuclear engineering university programs comes from. A very important part of what goes on at DOE, I think. Before that, he was the managing partner at Gallatin Public Affairs, and before that, I'm not going to go through a huge list of things. John served as staff director to the Blue Ribbon Commission, which was the commission that looked at America's nuclear future, particularly what should happen with spent, or now called used nuclear fuel. And this was a very important commission because this was the first time in a long time that there was any hard look at what should happen with the back end of the nuclear cycle in the U.S., particularly with the decision that Yucca Mountain shouldn't go forward. Before that, he was the deputy manager of the U.S. Department of Energy's Idaho Operations Office. As many of you also know, Idaho National Lab is the major nuclear national lab in the country now, and the Idaho Operations Office is at that location and oversees a lot of the programs there. He spent a year as the American Nuclear Society's John T. Seaborg's Congressional Fellow with Jeff Binghamton, who was a Democrat in New Mexico, also a very major proponent for nuclear power and nuclear energy in the system, along with the other senator at the time, Domenici from New Mexico. And he worked initially in the Office of Energy Science and Nuclear Energy Science and Technology at DOE. I think the most proud thing, despite that whole long list of accomplishments and positions, is that John is a graduate of our program. He got his bachelor's degree with us in 1998?
89.
89, sorry, wrong way around. And I know that because, first of all, I had to look up his middle initial to find him at NEI. NEI uses, instead of first name, last name, they use first initial, middle initial, and last initial for their email addresses. So this is the way I found him, JFK. So you can easily remember that. But John, you'll be happy to know that because it was 1989, when I looked this up in the university system, the grades were from 1989 are not recorded electronically there. I can see your GPA, which is good, but the rest I can't see. And even the class he had with me. So he survived that, and he's here today to talk to us about what's going on in the nuclear industry. So John?
Great. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Yeah, what a treat to be back, and what an added treat to know that my GPA doesn't, or my grades don't show up in that system. Yeah, and it's been 15 years since I've been back on campus. I did come back, I think when I was working at the DOE Idaho Operations Office, you had me come back and talk about our plans for standing up what was then, what was going to be the nation's lead nuclear energy lab. And the department has been making investments in Idaho since the INL was formed in 2005, and any of those of you who've been out there have seen that the place has come quite a ways. And in that respect, it has a lot in common with this place, because when I flew in last night, and they had shuttle picks you up at the airport, and started driving to the hotel, I thought we were headed to the Union. I didn't know this place, and the guy takes a turn. I said, what's he doing? All that's down here is the South Farms, right? And wind up at this great hotel and conference center and see the business incubator center across the street. It's just amazing the transformation that's taken place in the many years since I was a student here. It's also, and so of course, in addition to having Dr. Stubbins as one of my teachers while I was here, my undergraduate advisor is sitting here in the front row looking up at me, wondering where he went wrong. But so Dr. Ragheb was very instrumental in helping me find my way through my studies here in Illinois. So thank you, I appreciate, and we'll never forget the help and guidance you gave me as I was struggling through those early weed out classes, trying to figure out whether I wanted to stick with nuclear or wanted to go take a different path. Stayed with nuclear, and very glad I did. So thank you. So I thought I'd spend just a little bit of time with you all today talking about where I see nuclear energy headed in the U.S. and abroad, and really then want to take some time and answer questions from you all. And want to hear what's on your mind and get into a conversation with you all about where the technology is headed. As I'm sure you've seen, it's a challenging time in several respects for nuclear energy, but I also think it's a time of real opportunity. And let me explain what I mean by that. The challenging time you folks have seen up close and personal here in Illinois. So you understand that this combination of historically low natural gas prices, the fact that we don't have a price on carbon, and the fact that we've got subsidies and mandates favoring certain energy generating technologies have led to almost a perfect storm of market conditions that have caused nuclear plants generating electricity at 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour to be viewed as uneconomic, right? Which is just, from a historical electricity price perspective, that's crazy. But the way the markets have been formed, that's the reality on the ground these days. And Illinois and New York were the first two states to take action to say, look, despite what the markets are doing in the short term, we think what makes the most sense in the long term to preserve these nuclear assets. Other states are being faced with that same challenge now. So while Illinois and New York were huge victories, there's more to come, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that later. But if you've been looking at the trade press, you'll see in Ohio and Illinois, in Connecticut, in New Jersey, there are moves afoot in those states to also take action to preserve their existing nuclear assets. But those proposals are being met with some pretty stiff opposition, particularly from organizations that are involved in advocating for natural gas and fossil fuel production. There are also challenges, particularly in the U.S., facing the new construction of nuclear power plants, and I'm sure you've all seen the situation regarding Westinghouse and the parent company Toshiba, and the projects under construction in South Carolina and Georgia, and the uncertainty about the path that those projects are going to take here as Westinghouse enters bankruptcy and as Toshiba figures out what it's going to do with that company. And I don't have a crystal ball as to how that's going to turn out. We saw some positive statements, I think, just yesterday or today from South Carolina about their determination to move forward with the projects. But that's going to play out over the next weeks and months. But what that does show you is that this is an industry, in particular on the construction side, that's got a lot of rust to knock off if we're going to get back to the point where we're efficiently, cost-effectively, and timely constructing nuclear power plants in the U.S. And for all intents and purposes, we stopped doing that for 30 years, right? And the fact that we've started up and had problems with the first 4 units is not a huge surprise. The last chapter in the AP1000 book in China is yet to be written, but we do know that the first units over there have passed through cold testing, hot testing, and are looking at fuel load this year. So you think from a technology risk standpoint, those questions should be answered at the end of this year, I think. But from a construction risk standpoint, there's still work to be done here in the U.S. to get to the point where you can, that a potential customer for those technologies can have a high degree of assurance that they can build those technologies on an assured cost and an assured schedule. It's going to take more construction than just those 4 plants to work through, work back up the learning curve to get to that point. maybe that happens with additional light water reactors, maybe that happens with advanced reactor technologies, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then, a third big challenge facing the industry, in addition to the existing plants and the construction challenges, are competition from state-owned vendors overseas. When we know that countries like China and Russia are making significant investments and are also using nuclear energy system supply as a tool of foreign diplomacy. And I don't know how many of you read Foreign Affairs, but if you're interested in this subject, I'd like to call to your attention a piece that appeared last week talking about Russia's nuclear diplomacy and how they use the supply of nuclear energy as a tool in building long-term relationships with other countries. I'll talk about that in a little bit too. But despite these challenges, I think there are real reasons for optimism. And I had a great conversation after lunch with some of the students today, and they told me that some folks will tell them, why are you getting into nuclear? Isn't that industry dying? And I crack a smile and say, you know what? I was here in '86 when Chernobyl happened, and I heard the same thing, right? And at the time, nuclear was 15%, give or take, of U.S. electricity. 30 years later, it's 20% of U.S. electricity. Yeah, it hasn't, we haven't built a whole lot of new plants, brought a lot of new plants online. On the other hand, it's an extraordinarily important part of our electricity supply here at home. There's growing interest abroad. It's a field that employs about 100,000 people directly, responsible for about 500,000 jobs in the U.S. It's a field that, for a dying industry, that's one slow death. All right, so take heart. And what I add to that is, part of the reason that I have a great deal of optimism is I think companies are seeing, despite the challenges in the immediate term from low gas prices, over the long term, what we've shown in the U.S. is a nuclear power plant can be an extraordinarily valuable and reliable asset as part of your electricity system. I mean, the fact that we've seen operating costs, they spiked a little bit post Fukushima, but they're coming down. We at NEI, where I work now, are contributing to that through something we call the Delivering the Nuclear Promise initiative. We're working across utilities to try and find cost-saving measures that can benefit the whole industry. We've actually implemented what we call efficiency bulletins across the industry that we think can save over $1 billion in operating costs across the fleet already. I mean, so we're finding ways to make these plants even more efficient. Capacity factors last year were like 92%, record high. Again, when I got into the business, it was in the 60s, I think. Right? We're seeing companies that are involved in operating these facilities over the long term realize, hey, if you can get over that initial capital hit, boy, these are a great asset to have over the long term. So that to me is a reason for optimism. I think another reason for some optimism is we're seeing a growing number of policymakers across the country with an increasing appreciation of the benefits that nuclear energy brings to the system. And again, the actions taken here in Illinois and New York show that has translated to the state level. At the federal level, we're seeing action taken on Capitol Hill to support whether it's regulatory modernization in the NRC or the development of or support for programs to spur advanced reactor development in DOE and within the industry. We're seeing strong bipartisan majorities, all right, for legislation that is going to help create a brighter future for nuclear in the United States. And you may have seen last year there was a bill, an amendment to the energy bill that was directed at helping craft a pathway for advanced nuclear, passed the Senate 87-4. Right? We just saw another a piece of legislation get through a Senate committee with I think it was an 18-3 vote. I mean, we're seeing strong bipartisan majorities in favor of creating pathways to a brighter nuclear future. I mentioned the fact that we're seeing more state policymakers embracing nuclear and understanding its importance. The fact that we've got 99 reactors providing 20% of our electricity, the biggest source of zero carbon electricity we've got, more than 60% of the zero carbon generation in the US comes from nuclear. that is impactful. More and more policymakers are coming to appreciate that. The fact that you've got facilities that operate 24/7, that can run as long as 2 years without a refueling outage, where you've got fuel on site. You don't have to worry about fuel reliability, fuel deliveries. I don't know how many of you remember the polar vortex from a couple of years ago, for example, where in the Northeast you had freezing coal piles, you had natural gas pipeline pressures and pipelines, dropping near zero because there was so much demand on the gas system. It was the nuclear plants that kept humming and kept the lights on, right? In that part of the country, policymakers are starting to recognize why that's important, and so that to me is another reason for optimism. Yet another is the international interest I mentioned. The fact is you've got dozens of nuclear power plants under construction in countries around the world. China's leading the way. India is moving out in that direction. I expect to see them do more over time. We're seeing a large number of other countries that are looking at entering into nuclear for the first time. So it does look like there's going to be a fairly robust market for nuclear overseas. Yet another reason I'm optimistic about the future of nuclear is all this energy around innovation. All right, give me a show of hands if you've got an interest in advanced reactor development here all right, it's part of what you're doing. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of hands go up, and that's great. And we're seeing there's a lot of attention being paid to advanced reactors right now, and as well there should be. In the fact that you've got it's not just folks like us. You've got technology entrepreneurs who made their fortunes in places like Google and Apple and Microsoft, who are now sinking millions of dollars of venture capital into developing advanced nuclear reactor designs. That sends a message to people. I can tell you, when I was in the Obama administration, the fact that you had people of that pedigree coming to the White House saying, hey, look, you need to invest more in advanced nuclear, that got people's attention. Okay, and I think that's helping, again, to create this stronger bipartisan majority and this greater recognition, the important role that nuclear can play going forward. But it's not just the what we call Generation 4 reactors in DOE, but things like the small modular reactors, or even the advanced technology or accident tolerant fuels for today's reactors. Technology innovation going on that can have a nearer term application is generating quite a bit of excitement. And those technologies can form the basis for kind of the next generation of export products for our industry here at home, and hopefully for the next generation of new nuclear build in the United States. So for all these reasons, I'm excited about where we're headed with nuclear and the potential that exists before us. But there is uncertainty. And I talked about some of the challenges we face earlier. For those of you who are in some way dependent on federal funding, the attitude that this administration has taken thus far towards what we'd call applied energy R&D within the Energy Department, that's troubling. I will tell you again, for those of you who are concerned about this, what I'm hearing is that the people in Congress who provide funding for the applied energy R&D programs, so in particular, Chairman Mike Simpson from Idaho, which is where I live at the moment, on the House side, and then Chairman Senator Lamar Alexander from Tennessee on the Senate side, they have viewed the Trump administration proposal as dead on arrival. I mean, that's what I've heard from them, because of the draconian cuts that the proposal makes to important things like applied energy R&D. So I think what's going to happen is the appropriators are going to serve as the firewall against the types of cuts that are being proposed. The problem that's presented by the budget proposal coming out of the administration is it creates a dynamic on Capitol Hill where it's going to be really hard for the appropriators to get, particularly in the House, to get to the point where they can pass a bill. Because the more money that they add in, the more that folks on the hard right are going to object. And it's hard to see a lot of Democrats breaking away and deciding to support a Republican drafted appropriations bill. So it's hard to see where you get to actually seeing bills passed. So we may see even worse log jams in the Congress in the coming year on federal funding, but that actually might not be such a bad thing, because what it does is kind of locks in programs that already exist that at least are a reasonable place for us to be. It's not the growth that we'd like to see, particularly in advanced nuclear research, but it's better than where we would head under the administration's proposal. So the thing that we're working on right now in Washington as it pertains to the administration's proposal is, how do you help them understand the important role that applied energy R&D and the resultant U.S. leadership in energy and technology development, broadly speaking, plays in our U.S. influence, in our balance of trade, in our economic strength, all right, in job creation and what have you. And there's kind of a battle for the heart and soul of this administration in terms of which direction they take. Do they pursue a really hard kind of what I'll call heritage foundation approach? I don't know how many of you are familiar with their work, but it's they don't believe in government providing funding for technology development that's close to market. They view that as the role of the private sector. On the other hand, there are folks like myself who believe that particularly in nuclear space, the U.S. government and the taxpayers in general derive a great deal of benefit from us having strength in that field, and that therefore it's worth a taxpayer investment. And I think there are some people within this administration who will hold that point of view, and we've got to help explain the case as to why those folks are in the right. All right, and get to a point where going forward there's more of an appreciation for the importance of that type of work, and that appreciation is reflected in budget proposals going forward. So that's kind of one of the big struggles that's going on within Washington right now is sort of which governing philosophy wins the day. Now, I believe, and my organization believes, that as I mentioned, there really is importance and there really is benefit to our government as a whole from the United States reclaiming a leadership position in nuclear energy technology, right? So it's my belief, having been inside government, is that nuclear is a strategic industry. As I mentioned earlier, when we export, particularly a nuclear reactor technology, to another country, that starts what can be a 100-year-long relationship with that country. Right? When you think about, all right, licensing, construction, 60, 80 years of operation, the D&D phase, that's more or less a century. And over that time, sure, you're engaged in a commercial transaction, and that's important, and that generates billions of dollars of economic activity in the U.S. and tens and thousands of jobs. That's great, but you're also building a relationship with that country across a whole range of areas and organizations. Just think about it. You're probably helping them with educating their operators. You're probably helping educate plant workers. You're involved in helping with outage management and training. You're probably working with their regulator, all right, in helping stand up or strengthen a regulatory system. Physical and cybersecurity. You're probably working across those fields as well. And so you wind up building these relationships that result in the types of influence that the United States wants to have over the long term. That's worth investing in from the U.S. government. That's a message that we're carrying into this administration. And the fact is, if you look at the way we handle U.S. nuclear technology exports in the U.S., we have a harder system to deal with than any other country. It takes longer, it's more bureaucratic. If all we have is kind of the same general technology to offer that other countries have, folks are going to look elsewhere. But if we retain our role as a technology leader, people are willing to put up with the extra burden that comes from dealing with the U.S. They want the best technology. They want to work with the company or the country that has the best operating and safety record in the world. That's us. So how do we get to that point? How do we sustain or grow that technological edge that we've got so that we derive the benefits that come from strength in having a strong domestic nuclear energy industry? So that's one of the things we're working on right now in my organization. Of course, another one we're working on is waste. And as Jim mentioned earlier, I staffed a commission that looked at, all right, the administration had decided to shut down Yucca Mountain, now what? Well, of course, this administration looks like they want to go back to that. So they proposed funding to restart the Yucca Mountain project. They've also expressed an interest in moving forward with consolidated spent fuel storage in the private proposals in Texas and New Mexico. And that's great, because personally I think what we need most of all is multiple potential pathways to progress on the waste front, because none of them are going to be easy. And if you haven't noticed yet, we've already, folks who want to see nuclear power shut down, they're working actively, they're going city by city in the state of Texas, getting resolutions introduced to get their city councils or county commissions to ban the transport of spent nuclear fuel through their jurisdictions. That's how they're trying to kill the WCS proposal in Texas, is by isolating it, keeping it from being able to receive waste. So there's already a battle afoot even around these consolidated storage facilities. So at least my philosophy is the more potential pathways to success we've got, the better, because none of them is going to be easy. All right, but so that's another thing that we're that we're working on. And then finally, I mentioned earlier about New York and Illinois. We're working state by state. Right. One of the things, anybody who's observed Congress in Washington, D.C. over the last decade or more knows that waiting on Congress to do something is not a recipe for success. Right? Every once in a while, they'll find a way to compromise and get something done, but really it's the states where the action is in the short term. And so again, in this respect, I really want to call out the work that Dr. Stubbins did and others involved at the university here. As you all may know, he helped organize an event up in Chicago last fall, educational event, just to bring some different points of view in to help state legislators and other officials up in Chicago understand what it meant. What value does the state's nuclear plants bring to the state in terms of jobs, economic activity, clean energy, reliable energy, et cetera. And that really made a difference, just providing an educational opportunity for folks to hear from, and I was fortunate enough to be asked to speak there, as was my current boss. Just hearing from folks who can bring these different perspectives, to your decision makers here in the state made a huge difference. So thanks for that. I think I think it was a real public service, just providing that educational opportunity. And I personally, I find tremendous value in that sort of thing. And we're trying to learn from the experience here in Illinois, as well as what happened in the state of New York, to work with some of these other states. And I mentioned Pennsylvania, Ohio, New Jersey, Connecticut earlier. Those are states where nuclear plants are at risk because of market conditions of being shut down well before the end of their licensed operating lives. And we're just trying to shine a light on, all right, what does that mean? What happens when you lose 1,000 jobs at a nuclear power plant and the 5,000 or so jobs in the surrounding community that depend on the existence of that plant? What happens when, in the case of Connecticut, for example, that's 91% of their zero carbon generation? What happens when that goes away? What happens to your state's climate targets? Okay, and trying to bring that sort of information to policymakers. You folks are extraordinarily credible in that regard, and to the extent that you've got a passion for the technology or for clean, reliable energy writ large, make your voices heard. Right? I mean, that's the number one way, in my mind anyway, that if to the extent you care about this, get engaged. Was thrilled at lunch or after lunch to hear from a few of the students who are involved in Generation Atomic. What a neat idea that is, right? Getting some young folks who are really passionate about a clean energy future, talking about the role that nuclear can play in that. So as I look ahead, while we've got some real near-term challenges we've got to deal with, and we need to see some more dominoes fall in terms of supportive action at the state level, I look 20, 30 years ahead, and I see this passion that exists. I see the amount of investment that's going into advanced nuclear. I see the trend worldwide moving to a cleaner energy system. My old boss, Ernie Moniz, used to talk about the imperative to essentially decarbonize the electric sector by about 2040, right? I mean, it seems the world is heading in that direction. I just think, as aspiring nuclear technology professionals, you're in a great position to help, take the technology that's been developed thus far, that's provided so much clean electricity for this country for decades, and build on it and create a next generation that's even better, that's even more cost effective, more efficient, and really benefits our country and humanity for generations to come. So with that, I just want to leave you with that message and hear any comments or questions you all might have. So thank you.
We do have plenty of time for questions. And we have microphones, so this is being recorded, so down here in front.
Can you please brief us about the facts, not the alternative facts, about what mess up did Westinghouse do to get into that situation that they are in right now?
Yeah, and I've got to tell you, what I've heard all points back to a lack of construction efficiency. I'm not extremely deeply versed in it, but from what I've heard, just the coordination of construction activities on site, plus some rework that's had to take place, has been a big driver for what's happened in terms of the schedule delays. Because when you're building one of these facilities, as you know, whether you're getting 30% or 80% construction efficiency out of your people, you're still paying them. Right, they're still there. So the longer these projects stretch out, the more they cost. And so those are the sorts of things I've heard, but it's I don't have deep insight into.
What did they get them to purchase Stone and Webster?
Oh, that you got me. I wasn't involved in. I wasn't central in any of that stuff. All right.
Thank you. Two questions. Could you discuss a little bit about Pennsylvania? Because at least in one metric, they're maybe the second largest nuclear state after Illinois. Mm-hmm. And then also, what can we say to people who think renewables without nuclear, in particular wind and solar in the United States, is the solution to our energy future?
Yeah, good. Thanks. First on Pennsylvania, you're right. So you've got 5 nuclear power stations, 9 reactors within the state. It's an interesting dynamic for us because, of course, our organization's funded by our member companies, principally the utilities, and there are 4 different utilities involved in operating those plants in Pennsylvania as well. And each of them is in a slightly different situation, with respect to how their financial condition. Some of them are larger, newer plants. Some of them lower megawatt output. And so, while it's hard to paint them all with the same brush or describe their situations all in the same way, broadly speaking, you get a lot of natural gas production going on in the state, and in Ohio for that matter, and the availability of that very low cost gas without and you don't have big transportation costs associated with moving it around. It's extremely cheap. And as a result, you're seeing at least several of the nuclear units in that state that are facing real financial challenges, not qualifying for certain purchases and auctions within the market and what have you, and so what we've heard from the utilities there is. There's a real near-term risk of losing some of those facilities over the next couple of years. You have seen in the state a nuclear caucus form in the state legislature, and so you're seeing a bipartisan coalition of House and Senate members who are developing a growing appreciation for the importance of nuclear in the state. It's the importance goes beyond just the reactor facilities themselves because Pennsylvania has such a strong tie to the industry. Westinghouse, of course, but my understanding is there are 500 plus companies in the state that do business in the nuclear industry, and so it's a challenge that has generated a lot of attention there in the state. There hasn't been legislation introduced yet, but I wouldn't at all be surprised if there were some, later this year or early next year, because there does seem to be a growing recognition of the issues within the state. Your question regarding this sort of 100% renewables, renewables and storage, I think what we're finding is that most, even the NGOs that are concerned about climate and reducing carbon emissions over the long term, at a minimum, they don't want to put all their eggs in that basket. Some of them, I think, really recognize that getting storage at the scale required to operate an electrical grid is an enormous undertaking. And when you think about the amount of mining, the amount of chemical production, if you're talking battery storage, for example, you think about the externalities associated with that scale of energy storage, or flywheels or pump storage. It'd be a combination of things, right? That they just realize that, boy, that's an engineering challenge. That, hey, maybe we get there someday. In the near term, boy, nuclear is here and now, and it may be, at the moment, existing plants are more expensive than market price in some areas. But boy, they're important to keep around, and a near-term nuclear option, particularly one that maybe offers some flexibility in terms of producing energy products and services beyond electricity, but getting into process heat or hydrogen, renewable fuels production, desalination, whatever, that could really help benefit the system as a whole. So, and then go beyond that. If you really want to get deep into decarbonization, now you start looking at the transportation sector, right? And you look into process heat, right? The other sectors, I'm sure you all know, electricity is only about 40% of the primary energy use in the U.S., the other 60%, transportation and heating. And so if you really want to dig into those areas too, boy, you want a nuclear option on the table too. There are some who will tell you no, that hey, we can get there with just renewables and storage, but from my experience, that's a small number of serious. In fact, I didn't call them serious. A very, very small number, maybe zero, of sort of the mainstream NGOs, the big ones that believe that. There might be a few out there, but there seem to be shrinking in number. At least that's my take on it. Other questions, comments?
So I have to agree with you that nuclear is a very important option, and we have to keep it. Many of the companies have been going the route you described, whether it's in New York State or in Illinois, or now other states are thinking about it in terms of getting subsidies. I think Colorado perhaps will be next. The question is, how are we going to make nuclear economic? Look at what's going on in England in terms of the Hinkley plant, which is coming in at something like 80 pounds per megawatt hour price that they would have to pay. When are we going to get there? Because certainly you guys should be campaigning for having a carbon price. And to get a carbon tax or a price, whatever, but we need that. But what we used to say about nuclear, too cheap to meter, now it's too expensive to operate.
Yeah, well, and that, leaving aside the too cheap to meter, which I don't know that anybody really ever believed that, but on the question of the economics, you look at the systems themselves, and even today's systems, if you look at the nuclear island, okay, that's like less than 20% of the costs, all right, of the plant. The other 80+% is, either in your power conversion system, right, or the other facilities that you need. There would seem to be a great number of opportunities to reduce costs in those areas, right? And so one of the things that we had started when I was in the energy department, and I hope they continue, was an effort to try and mirror what was done in the Sunshot program, in the solar energy program. So some of you may be familiar with DOE's Sunshot program. and I say 5 years or so ago, I can't remember exactly when it was, they set an aggressive cost target. And they said, this is where, if solar is going to be competitive, we need to get here, right? Well, they had, by the time I left DOE, they had almost achieved that target, and they'd set an even more aggressive one. And what they did was, they looked at all of the elements of the value chain that fed into the cost of a solar installation, and they said, hey, only like a third or less is actually hardware cost. You know, the permitting costs that were involved and the installation costs that were involved, right? Yet all sorts of other costs that could be driven down. And then they said, okay, we're going to use this knowledge of what the cost drivers are in the solar industry, and we're going to use that as a framework for making decisions as to what research we fund. All right, and all the funding needs to be pointed towards bringing down costs in an area, so that it could all be brought together and you'd get an overall lower system cost. Well, we need to do, in my view, we need to do the same thing in nuclear. All right, and figure out how can you tease out, right, some of these inefficiencies, all right, or whether it's over conservatisms, all right, or maybe it's delays, because cost of capital is a big part of what it costs to get a new nuclear plant up and running. I think if you were to structure the R&D programs, or at least a part of DOE's R&D programs in that way, I think you could start to tease out some of these potential cost savings that can get you closer to the types of targets that we need to hit. I'll give you one example. Some of you know a guy named Bob Budnitz, right? Okay, Bob will tell you that a huge problem in nuclear is the way that the various codes and standards kind of stack up to result in enormous overconservatism and an overuse of commodities, right? I mean, steel and concrete, right, in nuclear facilities. And he's a big advocate of trying to rationalize the way that those codes and standards intersect, so that you still have adequate protection of public health and safety, but you do it in a way that's much more cost effective. We haven't pulled that string sufficiently yet, in my view, and I think we need to if we're going to get to it. Because at the end of the day, I think the problem is exactly what you've highlighted. All right.
Well, this is probably the most regulated industry in, let's say, in the United States, in the world, right? Probably they have a regulation when and if an operator can go to the bathroom and so forth. But my question is it possible to do it without having a disturbance event?
Yeah.
In other words, coming in with those modular reactors and getting started in some other direction, because it's we cannot allow ourselves to put all our eggs in the renewable basket. Only way we can do it, particularly with current prices of batteries, is if we're going to have a lot of dark nights, and probably cold ones too.
Right.
But my question is, do you have that kind of optimism? You sitting at the at your spot in industry?
Yeah, I think so. Particularly this question about the regulator, that's one that we concern ourselves a lot with. And in fact, if you look at my organization, the biggest single part of it is devoted to working on regulatory issues and trying to ensure that regulations that are imposed on the industry are actually necessary to protect public health and safety, and that unnecessary regulations are pushed back on. Another thing about nuclear, as you all may or may not know, is the utilities, the companies that are regulated, they pay to be regulated. That's pretty rare. Okay, but the NRC has to recoup 90% of its operating costs from licensee fees. All right, so you look at that. That's like $900 million a year. Okay, so you break that across our 100 nuclear plants. I mean, you're talking about almost $10 million a year, give or take, per nuclear reactor in the United States. That's a meaningful cost. It's a little south of that, but it gives you a sense of scale. And so trying to find ways to back that off is another important part. I mean, there's no silver bullet, but that's another important component of getting there. But thank you. Yes, sir.
As an outsider to nuclear power,
thanks for coming.
You try to understand for the expense issue. So these are reactors that have been built a long time ago. And then you guess that, well, maybe the bonds are paid off already. And you wonder why they're so expensive. And I read, and you could give us information about this, is that labor costs, in fact, are incredibly higher in nuclear power plants than, for example, a gas plant.
Yeah, and so you're right. These numbers are a little old, so my percentages might be a little bit off. But if you look at a natural gas plant, for example, you can have 2/3 of the cost is the fuel, right? Whereas in a nuclear plant, the fuel is something south of 20%, 20%-ish. And a lot of it is in fact labor costs. Now, even with that, though, you're talking about facilities, the ones that have been constructed, that are producing electricity at a fleet average of between 3 and 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Okay, depending on single unit versus dual unit plants have different cost structures. But that's if you look historically, that's very affordable electricity. If you look in the last few years where natural gas is just so cheap, right, then that's where nuclear has run into trouble. Now, your point about, okay, so our natural gas price is going to be $3 a million BTU, give or take, forever. Well, that changes if you put a price on carbon, for example, right? And who knows what happens? We just saw the state of Maryland ban fracking, right? So who knows what direction or what energy markets are going to take, or what changes might be imposed on those markets. And so, I would at least argue putting all your eggs in the gas basket, which is where we seem to be headed right now, isn't a recipe for long-term success. The cost you point to on the labor costs, some folks, yes, you can view that as a disadvantage. Communities will tell you that's a real advantage, right? If you want a great local economic engine, because let's say nuclear plants aren't built, in downtown Chicago, right? They tend to be built in smaller communities. You're talking about hundreds of jobs, or 1,000 jobs at a plant for 60 or 80 or 100 years. Communities, right, can build. You can have generations of folks working through these facilities. Communities form their tax bases become formed around the plants. There's a lot of advantage that comes because of the employment that's associated with nuclear. So it's a double-edged sword, I would contend. If you can still get to very low electricity prices or affordable electricity prices with a lot of the workforce right there, instead of sending a lot of money somewhere else, wherever the gas is being produced or wherever the solar panels being produced, that's a real benefit for the community that's willing to take on the mission of providing electricity for a region. So you look at it a couple of different ways. You have a follow-up?
I want to follow up.
Please.
If we believe that argument that the high wages benefited the community, for example, Clinton, Illinois, we in the United States would be building a lot more automobiles still. Right?
Okay.
And we're not building a lot of automobiles still, partially because of the labor costs. So I think your argument just doesn't sell in the real world.
Again, it's certainly so let's separate the existing plants from future plants. Absolutely sells in the communities in the states that host these facilities. Right? If you've had a facility there for decades, I'd call your attention to an event we did on Capitol Hill last year where we talked about the impacts of potentially losing nuclear power plants in the United States. And the most passionate testimony we heard was from a town selectwoman from Vernon, Vermont, who had recently lost their nuclear power plant. And they talked about the 25% unemployment in the region and all of the houses that were for sale, the people that were moving out, the erosion of tax base. So that, that matters a lot to people. And so, what in new communities that want to see these facilities built, that's a big part of the reason they want it, is because of the job creation, right? If we're going to take on the mission of providing electricity for, right, a much larger part of our society, it's nice to see that local economic benefit come with it. I'm just saying, so that, I mean, that is a real part of the calculus that goes into folks either wanting to preserve existing plants or build new plants. I've seen it firsthand. Other questions, comments?
So my question is, in terms of messaging and public outreach, so it seems a very common occurrence in the nuclear industry is that we're kind of in this echo chamber where, you know, we're reaching out and it kind of just keeps coming back in the same group and area of people, you know, the small nuclear community. How is NEI trying to, you know, branch out of that?
Right. A couple of different ways, and you're right. That's absolutely a challenge. And the fact is, you know, it can be uncomfortable getting out and speaking publicly about nuclear and about being an advocate for nuclear. You know, I spent a good part of the last year doing public meetings about the nuclear waste challenge and how we were going to use a consent-based process for siting new nuclear waste facilities. And, you know, it's a very uncomfortable situation. I was called a radioactive racist, a white supremacist, and I had a very nice older lady come up to me after an event in Boston and say, "You seem like such a nice boy. How did you get messed up in such a dirty business?" All right, and so it's a challenge getting out there, and part of it is because of the preconceptions that people have about nuclear and the image that it has, which I personally believe, and I think study after study has shown, you know, that even when you factor in the potential for accidents on a life cycle basis, nuclear is one of the best, if not the best, electricity generation technology we've got from a human and environmental health and safety standpoint. Okay, well, so how do you make that case? Well, one of the things that I think is really exciting is the innovation that's going on in nuclear, and one of the most effective ways that I've seen is you start by talking to folks about the next generation of technology that's out there, because people have concerns about safety. Okay, well, you know, we're seeing designs out there that are, demonstrably orders of magnitude safer than what we already have, which is, you know, an extraordinarily safe industry to begin with. But you start talking about those, you're talking about more compact designs, you know, designs that can provide multiple energy products and services, not just electricity. That's a great way to start a conversation with folks. If you're someone who's passionate about the environment, about the potential for global climate change and the impacts of human-caused carbon emissions, that's a great way to start a conversation about nuclear. You know, did you know nuclear provides more than 60% of our carbon-free generation in the United States? You know, so those are, in the fact, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that you've got some of the world's most iconic technology innovators investing in advanced nuclear right now. That to me is a powerful story. And then you can bring it back to, by the way, we have this first generation of facilities. They've been providing 20% of your electricity on average for the last 3 decades. And they continue to reliably help keep our carbon emissions down. You know, that's how at least that's how I like to enter into a conversation about why is it important to preserve what we've got. You know, and I don't like to, you know, try to build up nuclear by tearing down other technologies. I happen to think that we're going to, you know, have to make very efficient and best use out of all the energy options we've got going forward. I mean, you think about our energy use in the United States, and then you look at the rest of the world, and you think what global energy demand would be if the rest of the world had even half the per capita energy consumption that we have. I mean, it's staggering. Right? So when you start thinking about a world like that with 9 billion people, you know, in a couple of decades, I mean, those numbers start to get pretty big pretty fast, and you need everything you got. And some of these advances in nuclear, I think, can help pave the way for allowing us to meet that demand in a sustainable fashion. Any other questions, comments? Hello.
Yeah. So I know NewScale is still saying that they hope to have their first reactor online in Idaho by 2024. It being 2017, that has always seemed to me to be extremely ambitious. What are your thoughts about the likelihood of it actually coming online in 2024?
Well, they're in their NRC licensing process now, the design certification process. Obviously, you got to get through that. One of the things that we were teeing up to do when I was in the energy department was engage with NewScale on the next round of activity, because when you get through design certification, you're not ready to go build. There's a whole or first of kind engineering, all sorts of things that need to happen to get from a design certification level design to actual construction blueprints. So we were teeing up to help cost share that activity, because again, to my earlier argument, there's benefit to the U.S. government and the U.S. taxpayer from the U.S. having strong exportable nuclear technologies. And so that was the rationale. While we haven't seen this administration's fiscal 18 budget proposal, my guess is that program has been zeroed out. That's going to make it real challenging. There are other things that need to happen. Will that project be compensated for the zero carbon, for the reliability, for the other attributes that it brings to the grid? Will they get like production tax credits, loan guarantees, other tools that help get the AP1000s under construction in the U.S.? Will those still be there for NewScale? So there's a lot of things like that need to come together to meet that sort of schedule. But I think if you're talking mid 2020s for a demonstration of that sort of technology, I think that's really important. And at least I'm trying to make the case that the government ought to get behind that and try to help make that happen, because it will benefit the country in the long run. Other questions, comments? See one over here.
You'd mentioned the administration's cutback to, I guess, science funding. Could you speak a little bit more to that, maybe more specifically for the graduate students that are hoping to get their PhDs while the current administration is in office, with results to like national labs, like basic science infrastructure? A lot of the probing techniques you get at the large national labs are really critical for a lot of the research that we actually do here.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. And so, particularly again on the applied energy R&D, that's got a bullseye on it right now. Those programs, if you add up the fossil and the nuclear and the renewable, all told, that's $4 to $5 billion a year of the Department of Energy budget. The administration proposed to cut that by $2 billion. I mean, that's a huge hit. Again, I don't think the Congress will let that happen. Also, this administration does seem to be supporting things like basic science research. So the Office of Science in DOE was in for much smaller cuts. I didn't look specifically at National Science Foundation or other funders of science research, but at least the messaging coming out of the administration was they saw that as an appropriate government role. It was the stuff that was closer to market that was the stuff that they took issue with. But having said that, you've got both parties and both bodies of the Congress that understand why this is important, and so we've seen ups and downs. I mean, heck, we were both around when the nuclear energy R&D program went basically to zero 20 years ago, right, under President Clinton, and we've survived, right? So if you're passionate about it, if you like doing it, hang with it. You'll figure it out. Yes, sir.
Hello. You've said that the people in this room should have a fair amount of credibility out there, and you've encouraged us to be bold and talk. You being one of the people who have done that, saying you've been called names from time to time. What are the topics that get you in trouble, and what are the best ways to approach those in order to try not to be called names ourselves?
Yeah, so that's a much longer conversation. Happy to have it with you at some point in time. I think just some tips, right? So don't be dismissive of people's concerns. There are some people who, hey, I've got a PhD. I don't, but I've got a PhD in this, and you don't know what you're talking about, right? I mean, the people you're talking to, they've come to that point of view for a reason, and you don't know what it is. And so, you know, be respectful. If you're attacked in situations, all right, recognize that the person attacking you is not your audience. I mean, yes, you've got to respond to them. Your audience is the people around them who haven't made up their minds yet, who are looking at you and looking at that person and deciding which one to trust, which one's the most credible. Do your best to project trustworthiness. All right, that's people decide who to believe, again, on who they trust. All right, so credibility. It's a combination of credibility and compassion or caring, right? If you can project that, then you will do well. It won't be perfect, never is, but if you can do that, that's your best, in my view, that's your best chance of having a successful exchange.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, and I see it's past the appointed hour, so with that, unless there are any other burning questions, I will thank you for your time. It's really a pleasure to be back, and I look forward to talking to you all and working with you all in the future.
John, thank you so much for being here. We do have something for you.
Oh!
That won't fit in the overhead compartment.
Oh, marvelous.
Back home.
How convenient.
But to remind you of your days here, so.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, marvelous. Do I open it now or do I wait?
You can open it now if you
All
want.
right, well, come on, let's see what this is. It's not my transcript, is it?
No, we couldn't find that.
Whew. Aw, very nice. Thank you very much.